Blood slicked the trauma bay floor, a sharp copper scent choking the air. A dying Navy SEAL lay on the operating table, 3 bullets lodged in his chest. A rookie nurse made a desperate, unsanctioned move to save him. Then the Department of Defense locked the doors and asked one chilling question. The heat of East Africa is unrelenting, even at 3 in the morning. But inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of the surgical annex at Camp Lemonnier, Djibouti, the air was kept at the freezing 64 degrees. Danielle Jane adjusted her scrub cap, her hands trembling slightly as she organized the surgical trays. At 24, she was fresh out of her trauma nursing residency in Chicago. She had enlisted looking for purpose, expecting to patch up sprained ankles or, at worst, handle the aftermath of localized skirmishes. She had been deployed for exactly 11 days. She was not prepared for a ghost flight. The harsh, blaring klaxon of the base inbound trauma alarm shattered the quiet. It wasn't the standard alert. The monitors flashed red, a signal reserved for Tier 1 casualties. Off-the-books operations. Jane! Barked Dr. Richard Alston, the senior trauma surgeon, bursting through the swinging doors of the scrub room. His face was pale, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "We have a bird touching down in 2 minutes. No transponder blacked out. Radio says it's a single casualty. Critical. Prepare Bay 1. What's the mechanism of injury?" Danielle asked, her voice tight but professional as she snapped on a fresh pair of latex gloves. "Gunshot wounds. Multiple. That's all they gave us," Alston replied, already moving toward the sterilization sink. "I need you sharp, Danielle. These guys don't exist on paper. Whatever we see in there, it stays in there." Before Danielle could process the warning, the heavy double doors of the trauma bay crashed open. 4 men, unmarked tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas, rushed a gurney into the room. The smell of aviation fuel, sweat, and massive blood loss hit Danielle like a physical blow. On the gurney was a man built like a freight train, though right now he was rapidly fading into a ghost. His tactical vest had been shredded, completely soaked in dark arterial blood. "Chief Petty Officer Nathan Hayes," one of the operators grunted, his voice tight with controlled panic. "He took 3 rounds to the chest and shoulder during exfil. Repacked the wounds, but he's bleeding out. You have to save him. You have to." "Get out of the way, Doctor," Alston ordered, pushing past the operators. "Jane, get the shears. Cut that rig off him. We need a central line now." Danielle moved on instinct. The fear that had been paralyzing her fingers vanished, replaced by the muscle memory of 100 simulated trauma. She took the heavy trauma shears and sliced through the thick nylon and Kevlar of Hayes's gear. As the vest fell away, the true extent of the damage was revealed. His chest was a mess of torn tissue and bubbling blood. 1 wound in the upper left shoulder, 1 grazing the collarbone, and a massive, gaping entry wound just below the sternum. "Tension pneumothorax?" Danielle called out, her eyes glued to his chest, which was rising on only one side. "His right lung is collapsed. I see it." "Hand me a 14-gauge needle," Alston commanded. Danielle slapped the needle into the surgeon's outstretched hand. Alston slammed it into Hayes's second intercostal space. A hiss of trapped air escaped, followed by a spray of blood, and the SEAL's oxygen saturation immediately ticked up on the monitor. Suddenly an aide sprinted into the bay. "Dr. Alston." "Bay 2. The Ranger from the IED blast is crashing. He's throwing a massive clot. We need you right now." "Alive. Afraid of the..." Alston froze, looking between the dying SEAL on the table and the desperate aide. It was the nightmare scenario of combat medicine triage. The Ranger in Bay 2 had a chance if Alston intervened immediately. Hayes, with 3 bullets deep in his thoracic cavity, was statistically already gone. "Doctor," Danielle said, her voice dropping. "His pressure is 60/40 and dropping. Alston cursed, a violent, helpless sound. "Jane, I have to go to Bay too." "You can't leave him," one of the masked operators yelled, stepping forward, his hand reflexively dropping to his sidearm. "You don't walk away from my chief." "Stand down, soldier," Alston roared back. "I have a man dying in the next room who I can save. Your chief needs a miracle. Jane, keep him stabilized, push fluids, get the blood transfuser running. I'll be back the second I can." With that, Alston sprinted out of the room, leaving Danielle alone with the furious operators, a lone corpsman named Miller, and a man who was bleeding to death on her table. "Nurse," the lead operator said, his voice dangerously low. "Do not let him die." Danielle stared at Hayes' chest. The bleeding from the sternum wound was catastrophic. Pushing fluids wouldn't do anything. They would just leak out of the holes in his vascular system. She didn't have the authority to operate. She was a nurse, not a cardiothoracic surgeon. But she knew exactly what was happening. A major artery was nicked, and the bullets were acting as temporary plugs. As his heart beat, it was slowly dislodging them. "Miller," Danielle said, her voice eerily calm. "Get me a rib spreader and a clamp." Miller, a young corporal barely out of his teens, looked at her in terror. "Lieutenant Jane, we aren't authorized to open a chest. If we wait for Alston, he dies in 3 minutes, Danielle snapped, her eyes locking onto the monitors. "His pressure is tanking. Give me the damn spreader." The trauma bay was dead silent, save for the frantic, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Danielle took a scalpel in her right hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She made a swift, lateral incision across Hayes' chest, following the line of the trauma. Blood immediately welled up, hot and dark. "Suction," she ordered. Miller scrambled to comply, the motorized hum of the suction machine clearing the field just enough for Danielle to see the devastation. She inserted the rib spreader, cranking the heavy metal dial. The sickening crack of cartilage and bone echoed in the room as the SEAL's chest cavity was forced open. "Oh God," Miller whispered, turning pale. Danielle ignored him. She plunged her gloved hands into the hot, slick cavity of the man's chest. She was flying blind, relying entirely on her anatomical knowledge and the desperate pulse she could feel against her fingertips. She found the source of the hemorrhagic tear in the subclavian artery. "Clamp," she demanded, holding out a blood-soaked hand. She took the heavy Kelly clamp and clamped the artery shut. The monitor's shrill descending tone leveled out. The bleeding slowed to a manageable seep. She let out a breath. She felt she had been holding for an hour. Okay, we have him stabilized. Now we need to get these rounds out before they migrate and cause more damage." She moved to the shoulder first. Using forceps, she probed the muscle tissue until she felt the hard scrape of metal. She gripped it and pulled. Out came a deformed piece of lead and copper. A standard 7.62 millimeter round, typical of the AK-47s favored by local insurgents. She dropped it with a loud plink into a metal surgical basin. The second round was lodged against the third rib. It took more effort, but she wrestled it free. Another 7.62 millimeter, clink. "Two down," she muttered. "Where is the third?" "Luatstot, Atsowoy." The entry wound was near the sternum, but the bullet wasn't in the lung tissue, and it hadn't struck the heart. She gently probed deeper, moving toward the spine. "His pressure is spiking," Miller warned, his eyes glued to the screen. "I'm barely touching anything," Danielle said, frowning. "It must be resting against a nerve cluster." Her fingers brushed against something hard buried deep in the muscle wall behind the heart. But it didn't feel right. It lacked the jagged, mushroomed texture of the spent rifle round. It was perfectly smooth, almost cold to the touch despite being inside a human body. She clumped the forceps around it and slowly, carefully extracted it from the tissue. As she pulled it into the harsh overhead light of the trauma bay, Danielle froze. It wasn't a 7.62 millimeter round. It wasn't even a conventional bullet. It was a sleek, aerodynamic cylinder made of a dull, matte gray, metal-likely titanium. But what made Danielle's blood run cold was the surface. Etched into the side of the metal were microscopic, intricate grooves resembling a circuit board, and at its base a tiny glass node that was emitting a faint, almost imperceptible blue glow. "What the hell is that?" Nilla breathed, leaning in. "I don't know," Danielle whispered. Suddenly, Nathan Hayes' hand shot up. His eyes, previously rolled back and his head snapped open. They were wild, feverish, and lucid. Despite the massive trauma, despite his chest being cracked open, the SEAL grabbed Danielle's wrist with a grip like a steel vise. She gasped, dropping the strange bullet. It hit the surgical basin with a heavy, unnatural thud that didn't sound like lead at all. "Don't," Hayes choked out, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Don't. Let them see it. Hide it." "Chief, you need to lie still," Danielle pleaded, trying to pry his hand off. "Listen to me," he rasped, his grip tightening painfully. They didn't miss. They were aiming for me. Before Danielle could ask what he meant, his eyes rolled back, his grip went slack, and he fell into unconsciousness as the anesthesia finally overtook his shocked system. The heavy double doors of the trauma bay violently burst open. It wasn't Dr. Alston returning. It wasn't base security. 3 men in sharp, dark civilian suits strode into the blood-soaked room. They wore no badges, no identification, and carried an air of absolute authority that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the space. Behind them, 2 heavily armed military police officers took up positions at the doors, effectively sealing the room. "Step away from the table," the lead man said. His voice was calm, refined, and entirely terrifying. He was in his late 40s, with graying temples and eyes devoid of any warmth. "Excuse me," Danielle said, instinctively stepping between the men and her patient. "I am in the middle of a critical surgical extraction. You need to leave this sterile environment immediately." Ahmad reached into his jacket and produced a leather credential wallet. "Department of Defense, Special Operations Command. Agent Thomas Reed." "The sterile environment is no longer a concern, Lieutenant Jane," Reed said, stepping closer. His eyes darted to the surgical basin. He saw the 2 crushed 7.62 millipoint rounds. Then he saw the sleek, blowing titanium cylinder. Reed walked over to the basin. He pulled a pair of heavy, lead-lined forceps from his own pocket, carefully picked up the 3rd round, and dropped it into a specialized metal lockbox he carried. "What are you doing?" Danielle demanded, her temper finally overriding her fear. "That is surgical evidence. This man was shot." "This man is classified material, and so is everything inside him," Reed replied without looking at her. He clicked the lockbox shut. He turned to face Danielle, stepping so close she could smell the peppermint on his breath. He looked at the monitors, then at Hayes' open chest, and finally down at Danielle. "You performed an unauthorized thoracotomy, Lieutenant. You saved his life. Commendable," Reed said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Then let me finish closing him up," Danielle challenged. Reed ignored the request. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a violent chill down Danielle's spine. "I need you to think very carefully about your next answer, Nurse Jane," Reed said slowly. "Are you absolutely, fundamentally certain you pulled this 3rd bullet from Chief Hayes' chest?" Danielle blinked, confused. "Yes." "Of course I am. I just extracted it." Reed tilted his head, his eyes boring into hers. "That is mathematically impossible, Lieutenant, because according to our ballistics tracking grid," Reed tapped the metal lockbox. "This exact bullet, with this exact microsignature, was fired from a sniper rifle in Washington, D.C. 3 days ago, and it killed a United States senator." The silence in the trauma bay was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator keeping Chief Nathan Hayes alive. Agent Thomas Reed's words hung in the freezing air like a physical threat. "This exact bullet killed a United States senator." Danielle stared at the sleek titanium lockbox in Reed's hand, her mind racing to reconcile the impossible physics of the situation. "That makes 0 sense, she finally countered, her voice shaking but defiant. "I literally just dug that out of his thoracic cavity. Unless your sniper's rifle has a range of 6,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, you are mistaken. The Department of Defense does not make mistakes of this magnitude, Lieutenant," Reed said, his expression hardening into a mask of pure granite. He gestured to the 2 heavily armed military police officers at the door. "Secure the patient for immediate transport. Confiscate all surgical logs, hard drives, and biological waste in this room." "Transport?" Danielle stepped forward, blocking their path to the operating table. "Are you out of your mind? His chest is temporarily clamped, and he's down 4 pints of blood. If you move him off this table, his subclavian artery will rupture, and he will bleed to death in the back of your vehicle in less than 90 seconds. Lot So Reed stepped so close to Danielle that she was forced to look up at him. "Lieutenant Jane, the man on that table is no longer a patient. He is classified evidence in a treason investigation. You will step aside." "No," Danielle said. It was a single, flat syllable. She didn't know where the courage came from, but her hands firmly gripped the rails of the surgical table. "I took an oath until Dr. Alston relieves me. This man is my patient. If you want to move him, you will have to shoot me." For a fraction of a second, Reed's eyes darted to his holster, calculating the logistics. Before he could give an order, the heavy trauma doors swung open again. Dr. Richard Alston stood there, his scrubs covered in fresh blood from Bay 2. Behind him were the 4 Navy SEALs who had brought Hayes in. They had traded their blood-soaked tactical gear for fresh plate carriers, and their sidearms were no longer holstered. "What the hell is going on in my trauma center?" Alston demanded, taking in the scene. The MPs, the lockbox, and Danielle physically shielding the operating table. "Dr. Alston," Reed said smoothly, flashing his badge. "Agent Reed, Special Operations Command. We are taking custody of Chief Hayes. As where's Mag-LUR," a deep, gravelly voice echoed. The lead seal, a towering operator whose nameplate read Bradley, stepped past Alston. He didn't look at Reed. His eyes were locked on the MPs. "Stand down, boys. You do not want to escalate this." "He's a suspect in a domestic assassination, Senior Chief Bradley," Reed countered, his voice rising in authority. "And under the Patriot Act, I am seizing him." "He's dying," Alston snapped, walking over to the monitors. He looked at the vital signs, then at Danielle, noting the clamped artery in the cracked chest. "Jesus, Jane, you cracked his chest alone." "It was crashing. I had no choice," Danielle whispered. "You saved him," Alston muttered, a flicker of professional awe in his eyes before he turned back to Reed. "Agent, I don't care if he shot the president. He is entirely unstable. If you move him, it's murder. Period." A tense standoff settled over the room. Bradley and his SEALs formed a quiet, lethal perimeter around the table. The MPs looked nervously at Reed. They were base security. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a firefight against Tier 1 operators in a surgical ward. "Fine," Reed finally conceded, his jaw tight. "He stays, but the room is sealed. No one goes in. No one comes out. My men will guard the door." He turned his cold gaze back to Danielle. "And I need a word with the nurse. Alone." Reed grabbed Danielle's arm, roughly pulling her toward the scrub room. Once the door clicked shut, the ambient noise of the trauma bay vanished. "Chief Hayes woke up briefly before I entered," Reed said, leaning against the sink. "My agents heard him speaking to you through the door." "What did he say?" Danielle's heart hammered against her ribs. She remembered Hayes's desperate, bloody grit. "Don't let them see it. Hide it. They were aiming for me." "He was delirious," Danielle lied, keeping her breathing steady. "He asked for morphine and mumbled something about his chest hurting." Reed stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. "If I find out you are lying to me, Lieutenant, You will spend the rest of your natural life in Leavenworth. Do we understand each other? Perfectly, Danielle replied. Reed smirked, tapped the lockbox against the doorframe, and walked out. Danielle exhaled a shaky breath, slumping against the tile wall. She reached into the deep front pocket of her bloody scrubs. When she had dropped the strange titanium bullet into the surgical basin, it had hit hard. What Reed hadn't noticed, what no one had noticed in the chaos, was that the impact had dislodged the tiny glowing glass node from the base of the cylinder. Danielle had pawned it instinctively while reaching for a sponge. She pulled her hand out of her pocket and opened her fingers. Resting in her palm was a micro-storage matrix the size of a grain of rice, pulsing with a faint, dying blue light. Reed had the bullet, but Danielle had the data, and she knew exactly who needed to see it. By 0400 hours, Camp Lemonnier was completely locked down. Communications to the outside world were jammed, a strict River City protocol initiated by the D agents. Inside Bay 1, Dr. Alston had successfully sutured Hayes' artery and wired his sternum shut. The SEAL was stabilized but trapped in a medically induced coma. Reed's MPs stood rigidly inside the room, watching every move the medical staff made. Danielle sat by the bedside adjusting an IV drip. Across the room, Senior Chief Bradley was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving the DoD agents. Danielle needed to get the micromatrix to Bradley, but the room was too small and the MPs were watching like hawks. She needed a distraction. She looked at the cardiac monitor, then down at the IV line. She remembered a trick from her residency away to momentarily simulate a crisis without actually harming the patient. She casually reached for a syringe of cold saline, flushed it rapidly through the central line, and simultaneously tapped the EKG leads on Hayes' chest. Instantly, the heart monitor began to shriek, the green line wildly fluctuating into a terrifying, jagged pattern. "He's in V-touch," Danielle yelled, injecting a surge of panic into her voice. "Dr. Alston, he's crashing." "I need the crash cart." The MPs immediately stepped back, startled by the sudden chaos and the blaring alarms. Alston rushed to the table, eyes wide. "Clear the way," Bradley roared, shoving one of the MPs aside to give the doctors room. In the brief, frantic seconds of simulated panic, Danielle grabbed the defibrillator paddles. As she leaned across Hayes' body to position them, she purposely bumped hard into Bradley. With practiced sleight of hand, she slipped the glowing micromatrix directly into the open rest pocket of the SEAL's tactical rig. Bradley flinched slightly, his eyes snapping down to Danielle. She gave him a microscopic nod. "Clear." "Bob," Danielle shouted, discharging the paddles into the air to reset the machine, simultaneously fixing the EKG leads. The monitor instantly stabilized back into a normal sinus rhythm. "False alarm," Olson sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Looks like a loose lead." The MPs relaxed, exchanging annoyed glances. But Bradley didn't relax. He reached up, his thick fingers brushing the edge of his pocket. He felt the hard ridge of the micromatrix. A slow, dark realization washed over his face. He looked at Danielle, mouthing a single word: "Cover." Suddenly, the surgical annex plunged into total darkness. The lights, the monitors, the hum of the HVAC system, everything died instantly. Someone had severed the main power line to the medical wing, bypassing the backup generators entirely. "What the hell is going on?" Reed shouted from the hallway, his voice followed by the sound of sidearms being drawn. "Stay put," one of the MPs yelled in the dark, clicking on a tactical flashlight. Before the beam could illuminate the room, the MP was violently slammed into the wall. The sickening thud of bone against concrete echoed in the blackness, followed by a grunt as the second MP was neutralized just as quickly. "Jane, get down." "Doctor," Alston yelled. Danielle hit the floor, curling beneath the steel surgical table. She heard the distinct sounds of heavy boots moving with terrifying speed and precision. "Chief, we're moving," Bradley's voice whispered in the dark. Danielle heard the squeal of the gurney wheels. She peeked out from under the table. In the dim, ambient moonlight filtering through the skylight, she saw the SEALs moving as one cohesive shadow. They had unhooked Hayes from the wall unit, switching him to a portable oxygen tank, and were wheeling him toward the emergency exit at the back of the bay. "Wait," Danielle whispered loudly, crawling out. "He needs continuous fluids, or his pressure will tank again." A heavy hand clamped onto her shoulder. It was Bradley. He shoved a heavy, encrypted satellite phone into her hands. "You keep this," Bradley said, his voice a low rumble. "You played dumb when the lights come back on. Tell them we ambushed you. What is happening?" Danielle asked, her voice trembling. "What was that bullet?" "It wasn't a bullet," Bradley replied grimly. "It was a kinetic drone, a localized smart targeting projectile. Our government has been developing them in secret to bypass assassination protocols. The senator found out and was going to blow the whistle. Reed's faction used the prototype to kill him. But why was it inside Chief Hayes?" "Because," Bradley said, glancing back at the unconscious man on the gurney, "we were running security for the senator in D.C. Hayes intercepted the shot. The drone was programmed with a biological lock. Once it hit a target, it embedded and encrypted its flight data to prevent reverse engineering. Hayes took the hit, absorbed the evidence, and resmuggled him out of the country on a ghost flight to get it surgically removed somewhere off the grid." Danielle's breath hitched. "Reed came here to cover his tracks." "No, he came to cut the bullet out and burn the body," Bradley corrected. "But you bought us the time we needed. And you gave me the data drive." He tapped his chest pocket. "This matrix has the GPS coordinates of the drone's launch point. It leads straight to Reed's superiors. We're going to burn their entire shadow network to the ground." The sound of a heavy steel door being forced open echoed from the hallway. Reed's men were breaking through the barricade. "Go," Danielle said, stepping back. "Get him out of here." "You did good, nurse," Bradley said. He turned and vanished into the darkness with his team and his dying chief. 10 seconds later, the emergency backup generators finally kicked in, flooding the room with blinding harsh light. Agent Reed burst through the doors, his weapon drawn. He found his 2 MPs unconscious on the floor, Dr. Dre, Alston looking bewildered in the corner, and the operating table completely empty save for a pool of drying blood. Reed stared at the empty table, a vein throbbing in his temple. He turned his furious gaze to Danielle. "Where are they?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Danielle Jane stood tall, her hands slipped calmly into the pockets of her blood-stained scrubs. She looked the corrupt agent dead in the eye, her fear entirely replaced by cold, unwavering resolve. "I don't know what you're talking about, Agent Reed," Danielle said smoothly. "My patient was discharged. Nurse Jane risked everything to expose a shadow government assassination, turning a surgical ward into a geopolitical battleground. Did the SEALs make it out to expose the truth, or is Reed still hunting them down? If you loved this explosive medical military thriller, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more insane real-life stories.